G'day, gladdies and salutations, poddies. Welcome to Classic LNL. Last week I was talking on the program to writer and historian Patrick Morgan about the letters of B.A. Santamaria. And at the time I promised we'd replay the conversation I had with Bartholomew Augustine Santamaria, what a great name for a Catholic intellectual, back in 1996, in full. It was an encounter I never dreamed I'd have.
Johan, I don't think you should be actually doing the theme on this occasion with LNL because you're a Lutheran and I'm about to interview one of Australia's more compelling Catholics. I think we should have made other arrangements for the night. Look, Ray Martin might have got Don Bradman, but I'm about to talk to the opening bat of the Catholic Church, 81 and not out, Bartholomew Santamaria. Now, if anyone had told me a couple of years ago, certainly 10 years ago, that I'd be writing amiable letters to B.A. and he'd be replying to them, or that I'd be sitting down for a chat like this, I would have suggested that they increase their medication. Because for many, many years, B.A. Santamaria was, in my unformed mind, the embodiment of Catholic zealotry. And I'm sure he looked upon the likes of me, we secular humanists, as the armies of the night. But he survives and thrives. He's well over 80 now, and he's writing some very interesting stuff. Now, what happens is young colleagues of mine at the ABC bring in the latest sulphurous column by BA and show it to me, and it's full of wonderful attacks on economic rationalism and multinational corporations. And they don't know much about the bloke. They really don't know much about his history. They don't know that they're reading someone who Ronald Conway once described as one of the great social polarisers of our century. They don't know they're talking about the same Santamaria that played, wittingly or unwittingly, a major part in keeping Labour out of power for decades. Now, I pulled out Santamaria's Who's Who entry. These things, these attempts to distill a life. It is 1995 because the ABC can't afford the 1996 one. Let me just read it to you. This is the bare bones of the story. Bartholomew Augustine Santamaria, M.A., President, National Civic Council since 1957, son of Joseph and Maria Santamaria. Born August 14, 1915, Melbourne. Educated St Ambrose's Christian Brothers School in Brunswick, North Melbourne Christian Brothers College, St Kevin's Christian Brothers College, Melbourne University. Career: Director of the National Secretariat of Catholic Action from 47 to 54. President Catholic Social Movement 43 to 57. Secretary National Catholic Rural Movement 39 to 61. Publications: The Earth Our Mother, The Price of Freedom, Point of View, more than 69. The Defence of Australia, 1970. Philosophies in Collision, 73. Archbishop Mannix, 78. Against the Tide, 81. Daniel Mannix, 84. Australia at the Crossroads, 87. Now, it doesn't begin to hint at what this bloke been and indeed remains. Bob, we've never met. We've been side by side in the pages of the Australian for forever, and now we meet on wireless. How do you feel about that?
Well, when you read that potted biography, you make me appear a real pooh-bah. I really am nothing like that at all.
Well, what are you like, Bob? Because
I'll
apart from being older than God and a great survivor.
Well, I'm getting on to 81. I'm the son of 2 Italian peasants who came out to Australia at the turn of the century. I am just under 5'5", so I intimidate nobody. And I've been interested in the whole of my life in what you may call things of the intellect. Now, I might have reached radically different conclusions from you, but I like to believe that we went through the same processes. What else can I say?
Well, you're not merely an intellectual, are you? Because you've also been a brilliant organiser.
Look, I hate the word intellectual. I don't know whether you agree with me. You know, the Italian philosopher Giovanni Gentile once described intellectualism as a disease of the intelligence. And I think that's right. So I don't classify
Bob, I loathe the term, and I'm quite happy to agree with you on it. But
Splendid.
But you are, as well as if a PI, a public intellectual, we'll just say it and get it out of the way. But what makes you different is you've had a lifetime of organisation. You've always been prepared to get your hands dirty in pursuit of your moral and political goals. And that does set you apart from most people who pundits or thinkers or even a great many would-be activists.
Well, I'd like to say that it was all in pursuit of a preconceived plan, but actually when I look at the whole of my life, in the field of organisation as well as the rest, it simply seems to me to be one accident after the other. And you do the things that come to hand at a particular moment. They seem logical when you're doing them, but later on you wonder whether you shouldn't have chosen a different course. But the point that you make is right. I have a sort of a temperament, and I had the opportunity of trying to follow ideas into the field of organisation. I don't think I've achieved anything at all by means of doing that. But the truth is that that's the road I went down.
Have you ever had deep religious doubts at any time in your life, or have you always been, shall we say, consumed by certainty?
I've never had certainty. I don't know whether I can delay you for a minute to explain this rather complex reality. I am, of course, as you say, a believing Catholic. I suppose that the fundamental reason why I'm that is that I was born into a Catholic family. My Italian family, it didn't matter if my father didn't go to Mass for a number of years, came from a very deeply Catholic culture. I went to a Catholic school. I would think that if I'd been born in the Arctic Circle and was an Eskimo and had never heard the word Catholicism, I would have been an animist. But I do think that there's more to it than that. I have, after all, lived for 80 years. I've married. I've had 8 kids. I've got 34 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, so I know a little bit about human nature. Now, all my life I've thought about the arguments for and against religious belief, and I still think in a very realistic way about them every day of my life, and that doesn't indicate very much certainty. I recognise the force of the arguments against religious belief. I think they're very great indeed, and I don't think that religious believers who simply dismiss them are fair to themselves or even fair to their opponents. I've also thought of the arguments for religious belief, and they're strong. And all my life I have weighed them together in the same scales. And if I can talk legal jargon, I am a believer basically because I think that not beyond reasonable doubt, but on the balance of probabilities, as the law has it, the arguments for religious belief are slightly better than those against it. But I have to say to you that I think about this question every day of my life, and I'm certain.
Okay, well, having confessed to this complex cosmology, this complex view of the world, it amazes me the certainty of your political and indeed religious arguments. I mean, I'm full of doubt. I'm full of uncertainties. Indeed, the longer I live, the more problematical everything seems to me. But you've never shown that doubt in your writings, in your political life.
I don't think that I really express myself very well. The truth is that I am doubtful and remain doubtful of every judgment I make, whether it's in the religious order or the political order or the economic order. But what I try to do is this. I try to examine the arguments. I try to come to a conclusion. And if I come to that conclusion, I go ahead. I'm pretty well the same as a league centre-half forward in Victoria. When you get the ball, you don't know exactly what to do with it, but you know that you ought to shoot for the goal as it appears to you. And it's really dependent on a balance of argument.
You're 81. Do you fear death?
I'm quite sure that I fear the pain that may be associated with death. As to whether I fear death or not, I simply don't know the answer to that question. I wish I had the certainty of saying that I know exactly where I'm going, but no more than anybody else do I know, beyond my beliefs, what lies after it. So let me say, I'm not looking forward to dying because I'm afraid of the pain. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I fear it very greatly.
You know, if a novelist was to create a character called Bartholomew Augustine Santamaria and give him parents called Joseph and Maria Santamaria, people might think it was almost too good to be true. I mean, there could not be a more perfect name for your parents than Joseph and Maria Santamaria.
Do you know that I've never thought of that in all my life? That's never occurred to me.
I'm not suggesting you've made it up, B.A.
No, but it never even occurred to me. Look...
it's like you're on a mission, though, isn't it? That name suggests that right from the font you've been on a mission.
Well, you've said that. I give you my word, I've never even thought of that. The truth is my parents went missionaries, and if I can use your own word at all, and they were very ordinary people. My mother had only 1 year's education. My father had 4.5 years' education. They were real, authentic Italian peasants. And can I say that while I despise intellectualism, I have a very strong yen for peasantry.
I think that's been clear in much of it that you've written over the years, and that was also a part of your interest, in, of course, in the Catholic rural movement, wasn't it?
Well, yes, it became an interest, but really the truth is that I did that work because I was asked to do it. I was asked to become secretary of an organisation which didn't exist, in the hope of bringing it into existence, and the idea of a Collins Street farmer becoming executive officer of a group of some thousands of Catholic farmers is really a joke, and it's a great mark of their charity that they never laughed at me.
Let's deal with a difficult part of your life. Let's do it now. And let me soften what I'm about to say to you by reminding the listener that I, in fact, was briefly a supporter or an urger of Stalin's until I found out the awful truth. Now, of course, I'm going to raise your pre-war sympathies towards Mussolini. You were a fierce defender of him at the University of Melbourne throughout the 30s. And, in fact, someone told me that your thesis was on Mussolini. Why the attraction?
Well, that's not exactly right. My thesis actually was not on Mussolini. My thesis was on the history of Italy between the unification of Italy in 1870 and the March on Rome in 1922. It was not an analysis of Mussolini, but an analysis of the factors that actually brought him to power. As to Mussolini himself, when I recognised, as a person with large Italian sympathies, that between the end of the war in 1918 and 1922, there had been no less than 11 Italian governments, and they'd brought Italy to the very brink of chaos, the idea that there should be a government which could restore order was attractive to me. And I was strongly in favour of that government until roughly 1936. After that, things took a turn. I'll say something with which you won't agree at all. I tend to blame Anthony Eden for the policy that he pursued in breaking the Stresa front over the Abyssinian War. I think that if that front had been maintained, Hitler might conceivably have been contained. But once Mussolini went with Hitler, there was not much choice. I had to choose what side I was on, and there was no doubt as to what side I was on. But I want to make it very clear that anybody who could run an orderly government in Italy until 1936 was doing a damn sight better than the 11 prime ministers between 1918 and 1922. And
it has to be said that there were quite a few lefties in the UK who were quite attracted to Mussolini as well. No, okay.
Yes, but I think, to be fair to them, they probably had the same idea as mine. Look, I learnt a good deal about the theories that Mussolini espoused, nationalism, Sorel's syndicalism and so on. I thought that the ideology of fascism was simply manufactured for the occasion. It wasn't like Marxism at all. But orderly government was a value that I thought was very important.
I know that you were exempted from war service, and this was on the request of Archbishop Mannix. And so you spend the war years working where? Well,
that's not quite right. as a matter of fact, I was called up. I had my uniform, and then...
I would have thought you were too short for them to give you a uniform, BA.
No, my brother was as short as I was, and he was in New Guinea. No, it was the director of the Department of Agriculture of the time, Mr. Frank Murphy, who knew that the Catholic rural movement had organised a number of cooperative farming ventures in different districts successfully, and had managed to bring about, this was before the war, a rationalisation of labour and of machinery. And it was through his request that I was deferred and never exempted in order to try to spread that idea throughout the rural community, and we did to a certain extent.
What were you thinking during the war? What were you thinking
What do
about
you mean?
Nazism and fascism?
Oh, well, with Nazism I never had the slightest sympathy at all. In the Night of the Long Knives, you remember when Röhm and others were killed. Two of the people who were killed that night were, in a sense, friends of mine. They were the leaders of Italian Catholic Action, German Catholic Action, Gericht and Müller, and both of them were killed that night. So, there was never any sympathy there. But I was always very regretful that in the end Mussolini took the side he did, but I think, as I've said, that I think that was at least partly due to the mistaken policies of Anthony Eden.
From whence does your visceral hatred of communism come?
Well,
does it
again,
come from the same era?
Yes, it's in a sense, it's a mistake to talk of a visceral hatred. I really don't feel that much. But I began to feel or think the way in which I did think ultimately about communism when I read a book by Malcolm Muggeridge in Winter in Moscow. He published it in 1934, but I didn't see it until 1936.
And I didn't see it till the 60s, but a fine piece of writing.
Yes, it was, and he was, I think, almost alone pointed out what had happened with the collectivisation of the peasantry. But until that moment... I don't know whether you know, but at the beginning of 1936, I began to edit a small paper which, with a couple of others, I established called The Catholic Worker. And in the first editorial which I wrote, which was in December 1935, I said that it was not communism which was the main enemy of Europe and of European civilization. It was monopoly capitalism.
Well, you've been consistent on that one, BA, haven't you? By golly.
But... having read Muggeridge, I then read more, and I must say that the war in Spain influenced me a great deal, and I began to read more, and the totalitarianism of communism, even more than its anti-religious drive, actually turned me very strongly against it. But side by side with that, some of my worst antagonists were people actually whom I admired. I only wish that some of my Catholic friends had had the determination of some of the communists.
Well, in many ways, I would have thought that a Catholic and a communist are alike, but we probably don't have time to go to that one. Okay, let's... did you ever seriously believe that Australia was threatened by internal communism? I mean, seriously threatened?
No, that was never my view. My view was that there were very real problems, and the nature of those problems one could only speculate about. But it was never exclusively an internal problem. The control of the greater part of the trade union movement, and overwhelmingly the greater part by the Communist Party in 1945, and the 1945 ACTU Congress registered that, meant that those forces would have a very serious influence, if not control, of the Labour Party ultimately. But it came at a particular moment when, in December 1949, communism took over the whole of China. And that meant taking over then, I think, something like 750 million people. And then if you went right through the Southeast Asian, you had the Malayan rebellion, you had the Indonesian rebellion at Madiun. I saw that there was a very real chance of a major strategic change in Southeast Asia. And that, allied with the internal developments in Australia, I believe, threatened the security of this country.
A great many Australian communists passionately believed in the domino theory. and thought that inevitably communism would arrive here, not so much as a result of their internal activities, but as a process of historical inevitability. Now,
they looked at it somewhat differently. I looked at the strategic changes in Southeast Asia, and it's a very interesting thing that even people like Paul Dibb today point out that Australia quite inevitably will face some kind of a challenge from countries like China, simply because on the basis of power and population.
You're listening to Classic LNL on ABC Radio National, Radio Australia, via ABC Online and podcast, to the only program in Australia that offers frequent flyer points. This is a conversation I had back in 1996 with Bob Santamaria, once the most hated man in Australian politics and one of the key figures behind the Labor split of 54-55.
We haven't got time to sort of canvass the whole era of the split. But it sometimes seems to me, or I sometimes suspect, that you didn't want that outcome. You didn't want to effectively hack the Labor Party into halves and keep it out of power for the best part of 20 years.
I can only say to you that in the whole of my life, I have never voted Liberal. I voted DLP, and before that I voted Labor. And the split was the very last contingency which I ever envisaged. But when, as Clyde Cameron, who is today my friend, admitted in his reminiscences, when the Hobart Conference was rigged, and he says straight out that it was rigged, there was no alternative. You either threw in the whole of the struggle, or you said somehow we've got to bring the Labor Party into a characteristically social democratic position, which included opposition to communism. And the only way to do that was by a war of attrition, so that one day they would seek to come to terms on the basis of what had been Labor policy before 1954. If I could just interrupt you there, I don't know whether you've read Mr. Hayden's memoirs, but he looked into the facts of the split as a man who came into politics after that. And I think he'll tell you that it was not we who sought the split or sought to dominate the Labor Party or sought to dominate Australia. That's his judgment.
Once you'd routed the ism of communism, you still then had to contend with secular humanism. And along comes Whitlam. Now, perhaps it's an exaggeration again, but it's been put to me that you really thought Whitlam was close to evil, promoting the sanctification of promiscuity, the rise of anti-family values, pro-abortion feminism. Fair comment?
I disagreed with all of those policies that he pursued, but I hope if by a pure accident he happened to be listening to this, he won't regard me worse for saying this. I thought he was superficial, not evil.
That's the most cruel and terrible thing you've ever said, B.A. Santamaria.
It is terrible. I hope you'll forgive me.
If Gough is listening, he's certainly not listening now. Well, go on with that, because that's a fairly devastating thing to say about.
Well, look...
About the leader?
I regret to say we probably have very different views about this, but I believe that a society, to maintain any kind of cohesion, has got to rest on certain values. And the most fundamental of those values, I think, is the family. And I'm not talking in terms of the religious right in the United States. I don't think that they understand the causes of what they're complaining about.
Well, you wouldn't have much truck with them, would you?
No, I feel no sympathy with them at all, to tell you the truth.
You'd find them vulgar, coarse, stupid, etc.
No, look, I won't say that at all. But look, they speak about family values, and they point to things like abortion, and they point to things like juvenile delinquency and so on. In my judgment, the major factor in the present disintegration of the family is the persistent decline of real wages since 1973, which has really broken up what I may call the domestic hearth, forced married women, whether they wanted to or not, into the external workforce. And then governments devised paraphernalia like family law acts simply to make the emission from the family easy. the economic factor, in my judgment, is the fundamental cause of family disintegration. Now, the religious right never mentioned that. Reagan captured what I may call the Catholic ethnic vote in the northeastern states in the United States by talking about family values, and promptly freed the whole of the economy, which meant that the family disintegrated under the impact of his economic policy.
Both of us have gone back to the crumbling of Roman power and drawn parallels with current goings-on in our neck of the woods, or in our part of the 20th century. I've been writing a lot about seeing analogies between the Roman arena, which went on for 600 years, and what's being pumped out of Hollywood. You go much further than that. You say, in the grim competition of evil, no century has resembled the present more than the sixth, which witnessed the total breakdown accompanying the crumbling of Roman power and the barbarian invasions of Europe. It's that bad?
Yes, I do. And that's exactly what I believe. When I was at school, of course, I learnt that the Roman Empire crumbled under the impact of the barbarians. But what I learnt later was that the impact of the barbarians would never have happened, I think, and would certainly not have been successful if Rome had not disintegrated internally beforehand.
Well, why is Rome disintegrating now? You'd have
what do you mean by Rome?
I'm talking about the problems of Catholicism.
Yes.
Now, in a broader sense, you've said of Christianity in toto, if the chairman of the largest department store in Australia had lost half his clientele in 20 years, there would be a problem. Now, you're drawing parallels with the loss of market share with the mainstream religions here. What is wrong with Roman Catholicism that it is losing its market share?
Well, you'd be the first to understand how complicated that problem is. There is no doubt at all that the triumph of the process known as secularisation, which I think goes back to the Enlightenment and even beyond that, has really eroded all certainties, and Catholicism could never have escaped from that at all. But I believe that the loss of internal discipline in the Catholic Church is the major internal factor. And the result of that has been what we find today is that something over 90% of Catholic kids who've been through the Catholic school system no longer practice their religion. My basic reason, apart from...
I'm sorry, run that one past me again. Say that again. 90%?
Yes, and I know that I won't be very popular in some circles by repeating that figure, but let me say that on Late Line I heard the Professor of Theology at the Australian Catholic University last year, might have been the year before, say that 97% of young Catholics who'd passed through the Catholic school system within 12 months had ceased to practice their religion. My figure, based upon surveys taken at universities, is probably roughly 93%. But whether it's 93 or 97, it's a hell of a lot.
Yes, it does seem a bit excessive. And
excessive.
And if I was the chairman of that department store in the religious business, I'd be very agitated. It makes Coles-Myers problems look absolutely nothing.
Well, the problems are very deep indeed. And
but Bob, are they fundamentally problems of discipline? I mean, those who look at the Catholic Church and see its loss of market, frequently attribute it, of course, to excessive rigour.
Well, I do understand that they do, but as one who's been a Catholic all of his life, I think there are certain fundamental rules that operate in any organisation, and religion is not excluded, which really have a very profound influence on cohesion. If you have and you encourage, and often people in authority do encourage, what are known as religious dissentients in the Catholic Church, to slam-bang the Pope, to say that he's got no right to do this or that, regardless of the provisions of the Second Vatican Council, and draw his name into ignominy and contempt, I don't think it helps the cohesion of a society.
This is Classic LNL on ABC Radio National, etc. You're listening to the voice of the late B.A. Santamaria, who exerted enormous influence over the Australian political scene for quite a few decades. This conversation was first broadcast in 1996, 2 years before his death at the age of 82.
How does the Australian hierarchy regard you these days, Bob? I mean, I know there's always been a division or rather a different attitude up north and down south, but how are you regarded? As a great asset or as a thorn in the flesh?
Look, I believe that friend and enemy alike grossly exaggerate any influence that I might have. But if you've asked me a practical question, let me say this. I've often thought of my Requiem Mass, and I think that probably quite a number of bishops will be there.
Just to make sure you're dead, though, Bob, basically.
I hope so. I think that there will be about 3 who will regret it.
Well, that's 3 more than I'll get, so that's you can't complain about that.
No, I think there are a lot of people in the Catholic Church who think that people with your views are the wave of the future.
Oh dear, I hope that's not the case. I'm not on the road to Damascus, I promise you. No, I can remember once, and I can remember once being very impressed by a column you wrote on problems of sex within the church. You were absolutely blunt about it. There was no equivocation. You just sort of went for it, didn't you? You talked about the depth of the problems in recruiting, the psychological problems within the priesthood.
Well, I don't remember the column as a matter of fact, but it's a very difficult question to discuss. Obviously, you can sound very prudish and so on, but to me, and again, it's got as much to do with, if you like, peasant family background, I think, as it's got to do with religious belief, although both of them are parallel. I have always believed that sex is really the expression of love between men and women who pledge themselves for life. And throughout the whole of my married life, I just thought it was very important that we should be faithful to each other. Now, please, I'm not reading lectures to anybody, but that's how I looked at the thing. And when I see the Catholic Church, or not the Catholic Church, but a number of individuals in the Catholic Church trying to adopt casuistic arguments about sex which break that concept of fidelity, it really worries me.
I was actually looking more at the concept of a celibate priesthood. Now,
I see.
You wouldn't dream of budging on that, would you? You wouldn't dream of giving ground on the ordination of women, for example.
Well, they're two different things.
I know they are, but I'm just linking them as a part of this sort of terrible secular humanist stuff which is creeping into your church, Bob.
No, well, there is a very fundamental distinction. You see, in the Uniate section of the Catholic Church, that's Eastern Europe, we have a married clergy. It's the Latin rite within the Catholic Church that has always insisted on, or going right back to the early years, insisted on clerical celibacy. So that I have no fundamental problem one way or the other, except that I believe that clerical celibacy has been an enormous assistance to the, despite its difficulties, and one of the reasons I'm not a priest is that.
And you're too short, Bob, you say, that as well. No one will be able to see you up in the pulpit.
Well, that's right. That's perfectly true. But I could stand on a box, you know. It's been known.
As you often have, yes.
Yes, as I often have. No, the clerical celibacy is not a problem of principle. It has been an immense strength of the Latin Church. And I think that the arguments against it are arguments of balance, but misplaced. But it is not a problem of principle. On the other hand, the question of the ordination of women is a problem of principle, simply because Catholicism fundamentally rests on a belief that at a particular moment in time, and you won't sympathise with this, God became man and delivered a revelation. That's a very awkward way of expressing it. Now, part of the fundamental beliefs of Catholicism from the very beginning, from Christ's choice of the 12 apostles as his original priests and bishops, right through the primitive church down to the present day, ordination has been confined to men. And I find the belief of the church, which is what is fundamental, expressed in its practice. Now, that's a totally different thing from clerical celibacy.
Let's move from the sacred to the secular, and I want to raise the issue of a secular prophet, Adam Smith, who's much quoted these days in the era of economic rationalism. You're interesting on Smith because you make the point that a central part of his philosophy has been set aside. That is, his belief that there were social institutions so important that their permanence had to be protected, whatever the economic demands of the market.
Well, the economic rationalists always quote the wealth of nations, but he also wrote the theory of moral sentiments, didn't he? And it was in that he expressed the necessity of hedging in the freedom of the market, which he did support, but with those protections so that the natural institutions, family, religion and so on, were not destroyed. And in that sense, the German Christian Democrats and the theoretical thinkers who founded their doctrine, men like Röpke and others, they always insisted on the same thing, that there were limits to the freedom of the market, which in the end, if it left ungoverned, would simply destroy the society in which it operated. And that's what
Are we witnessing that now, Bob?
Exactly. And look, if I could recommend it, you know Foreign Affairs, the bi-monthly in the United States. I suppose there's no more influential journal. It represents views of the Council on Foreign Relations, I think it is. The May-June issue this year, it's only come out a little while ago, has an article in it by the Director of Studies of the Council of Foreign Relations, where he says exactly the same thing, that it is the unbridled nature of the free market, unchecked by firm institutions, and I can see that what he says is going to lead us to 1929. And after 1929 in Germany there was 1933.
And you've seen it all before, haven't you, Bob?
I've seen it all before.
How do you... The Roman Catholic Church is, of course, the most magnificent and enduring of multinational corporations, but you're not too thrilled with the secular versions of the multinational corp. You've never been happy about the selling of our assets to foreign companies, have you?
No, I'm not, and I'm not happy about it today, and I'm not happy about the volume of foreign debt. The truth is that we have sold the political sovereignty of this country to that thing that is euphemistically known as the market. And the market is simply an assembly of investment bankers, whether in Wall Street, the City of London or in Frankfurt, fund managers, foundations, and they dictate the whole of the parameters of the economic policy that this country can pursue. And so we find both government and opposition in Australia today pursuing an economic policy based on deflation, which demands a permanent pool of unemployed, which is pressing all the time for the lowering of wages, even though it disintegrates the family. And we have to turn, in my judgment, we have to turn into diametrically the opposite direction.
Well, it might be your judgment, but it's probably a fairly Pollyanna-ish view these days.
It is. If I had to take the odds to it, I'd give myself 1,000 to 1.
Let's look at just one aspect of the free market theory, or in fact it's almost theology, I would suggest, and that's downsizing. Now, I know that you regard this as a very brutal economic tool.
Yes, I do. I feel that it's extraordinary to me that downsizing penalises thousands of ordinary workers, and in proportion as they downside, chief executive officers of particular major corporations increase their own salaries.
Yes, to multi-million-dollar salaries. It's
exactly.
An obscenity, isn't it?
I saw only this morning, and I hope that I remember the figures correctly, that the salaries of chief executive officers in American corporations are 148 times the salary of the ordinary worker.
Where do you look for answers to unemployment? Is there any country on earth that seems to be tackling it?
No.
It's a Dorothy Dixon, because I thought you were going to say Japan.
Japan never let it take root, you know. Japanese unemployment was always in the realm of 2 to 3% of the workforce. When it, as a result of the crash of the Japanese banks, in the last 12 months it's gone up to 4%. the Japanese governing group, Bank of Japan and so on, became panic-stricken. And do you know what the Japanese did? They immediately began to operate on a plan of infrastructure, public service employment, which they financed at the Japanese discount rate, which is 0.5 of 1%. And on the basis of 0.5 of 1%, you can run an infrastructure program which, like the Allied Works Council at the time of the war, will employ vast numbers of unemployed. And you can do that without taxation simply by the creative use of credit.
Let's go back to the big picture. Let's go macro. The French historian Brodel, who I think you endorse, says, or is it you that says this, we're in the midst of a long historical crisis. When a politician says we're going to come out of this quickly, the historian wants to laugh. We're going to be in this crisis until the year 2000. I think that's a very modest estimate because it is a crisis of structures.
Yes, well, I think I quoted Brodel as saying that, and I think that is true. I don't know whether I can tell you a story about that, can I? Have
yes,
you got
please.
A minute?
It's your program, Santamaria. This is your life.
No, not really. I was at a meeting of a national conference of the NCC in 1976. It was had been a very bad year. It was in the year in which my friend Jim Macaulay died, and I wasn't feeling very cheerful, but neither was anybody else. And I could see that they were all very gloomy, and so I tried to conclude with what I regarded as a fighting speech to lift their spirits a bit. I knew that after me, Malcolm Muggeridge was coming along to speak. Anyway, Muggeridge didn't turn up while I was speaking, and I felt that I did lift their spirits a bit, and then Muggeridge came along.
Well,
and Muggeridge
dashed them thoroughly?
Yes, the end of civilization sort of thing, and I nearly died. So I got up to thank him for thanking me sort of thing, and he suddenly woke up as to what had happened. I made the point that Roman civilization had collapsed in the 6th century, but I said, now look, the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, Chartres, Reims, and so on. And he saw it once, and so he thanked me for thanking him and sort of built on that. But as we walked out, he took my arm and said, Bob, I hope you understand that between the 6th century and most of the things that you were talking about, 700 years passed.
Well, I'm glad you've raised that 700 years, because how long is it going to take to sort these small problems out?
I don't know, and I don't think it's given to us to ask.
Well, it might be given to you Catholics, but we secular humanists like to ask these things.
Well, can I recruit you? Not as a Catholic, but simply say this. What's important, I think, is to try to analyse the problem correctly, and that's damned hard. If we analyse it, and you roughly were to come to the same conclusion as I have as to the nature of the economic problem, then what we've got to do is to put the remedies into place, which I think are perfectly capable of being put into place, although the fight will be very hard. And I don't know whether it'll take 10 years or whether it'll take 1,000 years. But we have done what our duty is, and we can't do any more than that.
You're listening to Classic LNL on ABC Radio National, Radio Australia, and Into Your Pod, to an interview I had with the late Bartholomew Augustine Santamaria in 1996.
I don't know whether the Labor Party, the ALP, has much significance in the scheme of things that you're describing, but let's now go micro. Let's look at the Labor Party. What, in your view, is wrong with it?
Well,
we've only got 10 minutes now. So
all right. Well, look, I can do it in 10 seconds, and it won't be me. The leader of the Labor Party today, Mr. Kim Beazley Jr., has a father, of course.
Moral rearmament.
Well, Mr. Kim Beazley Sr., he was a member of the Whitlam ministry, so you should think that very well of that. When he left Parliament, he made a famous speech. And it was only the Bulletin that got it.
It was a great speech, yeah.
He said, for the benefit of our listeners, when I joined the Labor Party as a young man, the branches were full of the cream of the working class. When I leave it, they're full of the dregs of the middle class. I think that's what's wrong with Labor.
Well, let's tease that out, because you believe that, in fact, Labor has lost its heart and its heartland.
Yes.
that its traditional commitment to the working class and the lower middle class, and indeed to the farming communities, which is something that people forget, is of the past.
Well, it's of the present, but I don't deny that if the mark of good leadership in the Labor Party would be to recapture that working class, lower middle class and farming vote. And it can't be done without scuttling the whole economic rationalist theory and to go back to what one broadly would call the social democratic thesis.
What about the Keynesian ideals? Do you think they've still got currency?
Oh, I do indeed. Look, in my judgment, and God knows I'm not an economist, but no economic theory is permanently valid for all time. There are different theories that fit different changing situations, and this is a moment when, instead of what is called slash and burn, we ought to be embarking on a dose of Keynesianism to absorb a very large proportion of the unemployed. And I think that can easily be done.
That can easily be done. That's not
Yes.
1,000 to 1 against.
Oh, well, it is 1,000 to 1 against, but it's only a matter of human will. You've got to tackle the critical problem, the problem of credit creation. I don't know whether the Alice Springs-Darwin Railway as a characteristic infrastructural work ought to be built or not. Let's presume that it's a good thing. I've seen one figure, which I don't know whether it's right or wrong, that it would cost $3.5 billion. If you finance that by borrowing, you go out on the bond market and pay between 9 and 10%. The annual interest is $350 million. The result is you will never build that railway, and I'm granting that it's a good thing. But if you built it in the way in which the Commonwealth Railway, linking Port Augusta and Perth, was built from 13 to 17, when the Commonwealth Bank, which was the Reserve Bank, issued credit at 1%, and the Japanese are doing that today, you can do an enormous number of things that will absorb unemployed.
But of course you're talking about a social model where government actually has an enthusiasm for governing.
Exactly.
And that doesn't seem to be very popular these days. Around the world we elect governments that aren't really all that wrapped in governing.
Well, I'm often accused of patriarchy, but I think a little bit of patriarchy in government would do us no harm.
Do you think this pendulum swing will go the other way? I mean, that's something else that you've seen over a long life. You must see the pendulum swing this way and it swing that.
I don't believe in any such thing as inevitability, but I think that if enough of us, and I believe in Toynbee's theory of the creative minority, work sufficiently hard on the basis of a philosophy and a program, the program is as important as the philosophy, well, we're doing what we've got to do, and we've got a fighting chance.
Are you ecumenical in? Can you imagine yourself being a part of a wider group of people, way beyond what you might have imagined feasible or possible or desirable in say the 60s? Can you see yourself as being a part of a group who were passionately attacking the notions of economic rationalism, passionately pushing the arguments of Keynes?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I hope that he won't mind my mentioning it, but you would know that at the time of the Labor split, I suppose that Evatt was a facade, but one of my strongest opponents was Claude Cameron. I've mentioned him already.
Yes, with whom you're now friendly.
Well,
you and I are both regular correspondents with Claude.
Exactly. But there are a number of professional economists who have written to me on the basis of these articles in The Australian who are Keynesians. And,
so you and Nugget Coombs would actually agree on a lot of this at the moment?
I wouldn't libel him by saying that he'd agree with me. Let him speak for himself.
Well, next time I visit him, I'll see what he's willing to say on this issue. Now, look, I hear a rumour that there's a book coming out of the Santamaria household that Bartholomew Augustine Santamaria is writing his memoirs. I really had a shot at that in 1980, and I produced a book called Against the Tide.
but I have brought it up to date, and there's a lot of other information about the time of the split and so on that is now available.
Is it an intensely personal work, or do you sort of guard your privacy by dealing with issues and ideas rather than with feelings, emotions?
Oh yes, it's a political memoir, if I can call it that. I don't believe in washing my dirty linen in public.
Not at all.
Not really, no.
Bob Santamaria, you have in recent times described yourself as a failure. Let me ask you finally, what were your greatest political mistakes?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I suppose that I've lost most political fights that I've been in, particularly at the time of the split. I believed that a continuation of the type of Labor Party that is sanctified these days by talking of Curtin and Chifley, but it meant something. That would be relevant and adequate to meet the problems of Australia in the post-war period. And really, in my own way, that's what I was trying to work for. But in the end, I think that I overreached the resources that were at the disposal of my friends and myself. That's probably a mistake. But it was the kind of mistake that you had to make, because after all, the opposite is what we've got today.
Nonetheless, you must look back on the last 80 years with some pride and pleasure. It's been an exuberant and extraordinary life.
Let me be facetious. I remember a priest saying to Archbishop Mannix that he was going to be facetious, and the Archbishop said afterwards, no, facetious means, in your case, was fatuous. The things that I really have enjoyed in my life, apart from the serious things, is watching my club Carlton win the premiership last year, as they won in 1970.
That's the weirdest thing about you. Are you one of these characters that sees in Australian rules football some sort of metaphors, cosmological metaphors like...
Yes, I do. Before it was taken over by financiers who were destroying it, I saw in it, and I occasionally still see it today, the triumph of physical and moral purpose over the incarnate evil of the opposition.
Well, that's a good moment, I think, on which to wind up. Well, Bartholomew, Augustine, Santamaria, I thank you for your time. It's been a fascinating encounter.
Thank you very much, Philip.
That conversation with B.A. Santamaria, first broadcast in 1996, 2 years before his death at the age of 82. Santa was the former president of the National Civic Council, director of the National Secretariat of Catholic Action, and secretary of the National Catholic Rural Movement, only outflanked by His Holiness the Pope. He was also the author of many publications, including The Price of Freedom, The Defence of Australia, and Against the Tide, Australia at the Crossroads. They give you the feeling of what he was on about. Oh, as well as his acclaimed biography of Archbishop Daniel Mannix. And we'll bring you another classic LNL at the same time next week, but please stick around on ABC Radio National for the good news, and we'll see you later.